Greetings to you in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. I trust that you are rejoicing today in the blessings of God. The text for our message today is from James, so you may turn to James chapter 1. I'll be reading from James 1 today. As you know, I've launched on a journey through this epistle of James, and in the last message we discussed the author, James. This man was obviously someone who was close to Jesus. Quite possibly, he was even a brother of the Lord. But to James now, Jesus is his Lord and his Christ. And in fact, this is the most important thing to James, far more important than his tie to Jesus as a brother. Far more important to that is the fact that Jesus is his Lord. Jesus is his Christ. And he calls himself the bondservant of Jesus. And we looked at some ways in which James served his Lord. One of those ways is that he penned this letter. We also discussed some of the facts surrounding the recipients of this letter. There were enclaves of followers of Jesus in communities throughout the world, mostly ethnic Jews, but with a growing community of Gentile believers as well joining in. Many of these people were far away from their homes, their mother countries. They had been driven there for a variety of reasons, including persecution. So I closed the message last time with a plea for us to consider the people around the globe today who are suffering physically for the sake of Jesus Christ, to remember them in prayer. And so that was one verse, James 1:1. Now, today, James will get right into the intent of his letter. And we'll see that James is not one for small talk. James is not going to discuss the weather with us today. He's not going to tell us about his pet puppy. You know what I mean? When I tell you that you've probably been in a conversation with someone, and there's this obvious topic that needs to be discussed, sort of like the elephant in the room, and you know that you need to talk about it, but your friend just darts around with small talk all around the issue as he politely prattles on and on. You wonder, when will he ever get to the subject? And I remember conversations in which there was small talk throughout the entire conversation, and we never did get to the point. And I think we might all be guilty sometimes of small talk, of chattering without getting to the point. But James is not like that. He gets right to the message straight away, and I believe we can learn from him. So let's go with him, and I will read James chapter 1. I'm going to read verse 1 again, and then 2 through 4 is our text for today. James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. The title of the message today is When Mr. Trial Calls In. What will you do when Mr. Trial comes knocking? As scattered Christians gathered in their synagogues and heard this letter from James read to them for the very first time, I think they could identify with his opening lines. They understood the meaning of the word trials. They knew about things like testing of faith. Some of these people had been forced to uproot from their homes and to rebuild their lives in other places where there was less opposition. So they could identify with James in his opening statement. As we Christians gather today in our rather comfortable homes, can we relate to what James says in verse 2 in the same way that the first listeners did? Maybe not, but maybe so. And I think we can. I think we should. I think we shall. But you see, we like to think that if we would ever face a persecution like imprisonment or physical torture or even death, that we would do so with joy. We would testify for Jesus with a glow on our faces like Stephen had when he was martyred. We'd sing like Paul and Silas did when they were in prison. We'd spend the night in prison and we'd sing and pray. We'd even make quotable quotes like people did, such as Conrad Grebel and Corrie ten Boom and Jim Elliot. Things that people would remember and repeat for years to come. I think all Christians would have the desire to be faithful and joyful while experiencing the duresses of a physical persecution. And it might be easy for us to assume that it is to these situations that James is speaking in verse 2 when he says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials." But I want to tell you this morning that James is casting a net that is much wider. He's talking to people who are going through all kinds of trials. The King James Version, the Old King James Version, says diverse trials. The version that I read, the New King James, says various trials. And the word means motley or various in kind, various in character, various in size. There's some other translations and paraphrases that would say things like having tests of every sort, being tested in different ways, tests and challenges coming from all sides. So I hope that by now James has your attention. I hope by now that you realize that this message is for you. What were some of the various trials that James's audience faced? Well, James will soon write about death, and he'll talk about the sudden death that can come to anyone. So I'm sure that people that listened to the message of James first were people who knew about the loss of loved ones, and were grieving. And some of you know about the loss of loved ones, and you are grieving. That's a trial. James will also soon write about orphans and widows. There was grief and there were needs, spiritual and physical, among a segment of people in their communities. Orphans and widows. Some of you are experiencing grief and spiritual and physical needs as well. James will later also write about sickness, people who are ill. So there were ill people among them. Poor health, whether it's a short-term thing or a chronic condition, is indeed a trial that people then endured. And some of you today have physical ailments. It's a trial for you. And it's a trial for anyone who has a loved one who is ill. Because James uses the word various, I think you can include many things under the heading of the word trials. Some trials that I thought of include, and some of these are experiences that I had very recently, not all of them, but I'm speaking out of my experience, running out of heating oil, having your motives misunderstood and even questioned, having a flat battery, having difficult co-worker relationships, having unmet personal dreams, having a financial hardship, having a costly accident, feeling rejected, having frozen water pipes. Now, I said that some of these I experienced in the past. Some of them you may have experienced as well. Various trials, James says. That's big trials, little trials, trials of all kinds. When Mr. Trial calls in, when he comes knocking at your door, what will you do? How will you respond? Our sentiment would be that we would all bravely beam and have this supernatural smile of joy and grace when we're facing an external persecution because of our faith in the Lord. But what about those trials, those other trials that come to us? James says, count it all joy. Count it all joy. For every situation, in every trial, count it all joy. Now, that doesn't mean that we're to be happy when we're in a trial. James is not saying that we must go looking for trials so we can have a chance to be joyful. James clarifies that these trials are something that we fall into. Did you notice that? Not falling into as in falling into sin. No, the word fall into is very similar to a story that Jesus gives in Luke. It's a story that he tells of the Good Samaritan, and that's in Luke 10. Jesus tells there of a certain man who went on a trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, and as he was on his journey, he fell among thieves. Now, this man did not plan his day with thieves in mind. He was not looking around every bend looking for thieves. I don't think he was. If he would have been thinking about thieves and the possibility of being robbed, he may never have gotten out of bed that morning and embarked on his trip. But as he traveled, as he was on the road, it says he fell among thieves. They jumped out and robbed him. I believe that's what James is talking about when you fall into various trials. This is life, and we're experiencing life. We know about it. We don't wake up and anticipate. We don't wake up in the morning and anticipate that we will receive a certain phone call today, which some of you have received in your lifetime. That is shocking and life-changing. You don't plan for how another will respond to what you say or do. Sometimes we forget to check the level in the tank. Sometimes we assume that we had signed up for something, and what we actually received or what we got into was something quite different than what we had planned for, and on and on and on. Many of us don't plan. I should say it this way: most of our trials, many of our trials, probably almost all of our trials, are unexpected. Things that we did not anticipate, things that we did not plan for, but we fell into them anyway. And James says, count it all joy. So on the accounting side of your ledger, don't use red ink when you encounter a trial. Use black ink. This is not a loss. This is a gain. It belongs on the profit side. James says, count it all joy. But why? Why rejoice about this? Well, verse 3 explains. James tells us that we know something. James says, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. There's something about knowing. There's something about knowing. There's something about having knowledge that changes the picture. I think it was Francis Bacon who is credited with the quote, knowledge is power. Did you ever hear that? And I suppose a full embrace of that idea would get us as humans into trouble because we are not all knowing and we are not all powerful. Sometimes we tend to think that we are or that we can be, but we're not. But there is a knowledge that when we possess, it is a real, I would call it a game changer. I'll give you the example of my wife and I. When we were courting, we had lots of questions about each other, but we liked each other. We impressed each other. But there were some rocky, little bumpy stretches on the road when we were courting. But I remember the first time that Amy said these words to me, I love you. The knowledge of that she wasn't dating me because I was a nice person or something like that, but that she really loved me. When I realized that, when I knew that changed our relationship. That made a huge difference in the depth of our commitment in our relationship. Knowing changes things. What did James know, and what is James convinced that his listeners, that we should know? It is this, that the testing of our faith produces patience. Now here we encounter a word that we will find repeated in James. It's the word faith. And maybe when you think of James, when you think of the epistle of James, that's one of the first things that you think about is the word faith. And indeed, faith is one of the big themes in this letter that James wrote. Faith versus works. Well, no, it's not quite that simple, is it? Faith and works. Or we'll hopefully learn that faith that produces works is one of those great themes that the writer James will explore with us. But I find it really, really fascinating that James sets this word faith in the first time he uses it, not with works, but with knowledge, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. Now, the relationship of knowledge and faith is a big subject to explore. And James, as a theologian, doesn't go into a lot of details about that, like his brother Paul may have done. But I find it very interesting that James does use faith in the context of knowledge in the first time he uses it, to remind us that the faith that he's talking about is not the kind of faith that would resemble, maybe for an example, leaping out of an airplane into the night, clutching a tarpaulin, and hoping that everything will be grand. I would compare that instead, or I would contrast that first picture with this one. Imagine going to the airport in Kilkenny, and there's a place there that offers skydiving classes. And imagine with me a person who is about to jump out of an airplane. He's terrified. He's never parachuted, as they say here. He's never done that before. And the idea of free falling from altitudes of up to 10,000 feet, dropping through the skies at 200 kilometers an hour is scary. As well it should be. But the other person is an instructor. You see, there's a tandem skydiving. There is a first-timer, and there is a veteran who has jumped hundreds and maybe thousands of times. He has prepared this parachute. He's calm. He will see to it that while the fall will be exhilarating, it will also be conducted safely and in a controlled manner. This first-timer, this newbie, can leap because he's attached to someone that he knows is trustworthy. Yes, it is frightening, but his faith is tied and is based on the knowledge of the aforementioned facts that I gave. He's with someone who knows what he's doing. Our faith is not a leap into the unknown. Faith is you and me committing to an action, although we don't know the outcome, but we base our decision upon evidence. And that evidence is the knowledge of God through our own experience and in learning of the experiences of others. And James, in this letter, throughout this letter, will appeal to our personal experience. He talks about the implanted or the engrafted Word of God that God puts into our hearts. He will also appeal by using proofs of evidences in the lives of others. He'll refer to people like Rahab and Elijah and other people and how God worked in their lives. James says here that you have this knowledge, both from your own past and from observing other people, that your faith will be tested, and that testing will produce patience. You see, the faith when it is birthed is a very fragile thing. And depending on the environment in which we allow it to live in, faith can become weak and sickly and frail. Some years ago, I sensed about my own faith that it needed to grow, and I prayed to God that he would increase my faith. And I'm learning, and I have been learning, that God just doesn't increase our faith by pushing a button and saying presto, but there's a means by which he does increase and give us strengthened faith. James's friend Peter, writing to another group of Christians who were facing trials, says this in 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7. In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter tells us that trials of testing prove the genuineness of our faith. So, when you're tested, will you throw a spanner across the garage because the bolt and the nut are rusted together and you can't get the part separated? Or, in that moment, will you throw yourself upon the grace and mercy of God and ask him to help you in your time of need? I believe it's important at this point to remind us that God is sovereign and he's in control of every moment in time and of every millimeter in this universe. But just because God is sovereign does not mean that he is the sender of every trial that we face. I don't really think that it's healthy for us to have a picture of God who is thinking up of all kinds of ways in which he can make our lives difficult, and that he would do this to test us and then to grade us on our performance on the faith scale. How is he doing? So I will put a test in front of him. God may purposely place us in difficult situations sometimes to help us grow. I grant you that. But we also need to remember that we have an enemy of our soul, and he's also God's enemy, and his desire is to destroy us. And I believe that our study in James will clearly display this and prove this. So while God may not be the sender of the particular trial that you're enduring right now, I do believe this: it's still always his desire that a good and positive effect would come from every single trial that you face, so that he would receive the ultimate in praise and honor and glory from your life. And James will tell us then about one of those good positive effects: patience. He says, your faith, that testing will produce patience. Some other Bible versions say endurance or perseverance or steadfastness. My Uncle Alfred and Aunt Martha are some of the most patient people I know. They're the parents of 17 children. And that achievement in itself, I think, would allow them to accept an award for the most patient people in the world. But 5 of their children were born with a condition which essentially rendered them infant-like, even as they grew into adulthood. And these 5 children required full-time care. Sometimes these children would cry for days without stopping. But they cared for these children in their home. Whenever I meet Alfred and Martha, I am always very aware that I'm in the presence of people who have been tried and who have come through victorious. They're always so gracious and kind and are aware of the needs of other people around them. I use my relatives as an example, as we inspect verse 3 more closely. Is learning to be patient, to be more patient, the end result? Is it the end goal of being tested, of enduring a trial? So we endure a trial so we can learn patience, so that we can endure trials, so that we can learn to be more patient, so that we can endure more trials, so that we can learn to be even more patient. Did my uncle and aunt have one child with special needs to teach them to learn patience, so that they could have two children with special needs to teach them to learn patience, so that they could have four children with special needs, and on and on? Is patience the goal? Shall I feel I'm an impatient person, shall I as an impatient person pray for more patience? Yes, I should, but why? Often it seems like patience is such a passive thing, and I want action. I want something to fix my problems, and patience doesn't seem to really fix it a lot. Sometimes it almost seems like patience is kind of a coping mechanism to just placidly deal with the trials of life. I want to change, and I want the problems to go away. I don't want to be passive. I want to be active. But according to James, patience is not a passive thing. In fact, it's not the goal, neither. In verse 4, patience gets busy. Patience gets to work. Look at it. James tells us here that this perfect work of patience is what it does. It does not so much change the trial or take away the trial, but it changes you. It's all about changing you. It's all about developing you. And James gives us three areas in which patience is busy at work within you. You'll find that these three things, these tools, will give you what you need as you find your way through a trial. Verse 4 says, "But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." The first word is perfect. That doesn't mean sinless. It means growing into maturity. James tells us in his kind way, it's time for you to grow up. Sometimes we think of the potential of an acorn as we hold this small acorn in our hand, and I think we should also look at the towering oak and remember that it was once an acorn. Mighty oaks from little acorns grow. Think of it, from acorn to seedling to sapling to young tree to middle-sized tree to large oak. Every ring on that tree's trunk represents another season of wind and drought. As we grow up, we begin to realize, well, I've faced a trial before. I've been through this kind of thing before, and by God's grace, I've overcome. And by God's grace, I will overcome again. Perfect means growing up, being mature. Secondly, complete. James may have used this word, this example, from the Olympics. And I think that most of the Jews who heard this read to them would have known about the Greek games that were played in their cities. There was one event, it was actually a series of 5 events called the pentathlon that they did together. One athlete would do the long jump, the javelin throw, the discus throw, a foot race, and wrestle. And for an athlete to be considered complete, he would need to complete all 5 of these events. So the particular trial that you're experiencing right now may be revealing an area of need in your life to you. In this particular trial, you may need to be especially mindful of being loving. And you're realizing that it's an area that you need to grow in. The next trial might reveal to you that you are really deficient in humility. Still another crowd might tell you that you need to be more organized and plan ahead. You might have developed strengths in some areas, and you might still be weak in other areas. In fact, I can tell you that you are strong in some areas and weak in other areas. To be complete, to be entire, means that you are growing in a full range. You can do all 5 of the events in the pentathlon. You're growing. You're complete. And thirdly, lacking nothing. In a way, lacking nothing is just the opposite of being perfect and entire. It's just another way to say it, maybe. But I don't think that James is just tacking words onto this epistle to pad it, to make it 1,000 words or 2,000 words. James is not like that. Lacking nothing, I think, is James's way of reminding us of Jesus. His Jesus. We lack. We want, like the King James says, wanting nothing. This is James harking back to Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. In this trial, in this particular thing that I'm going through right now, I shall not lack. I shall not want, because the Lord my shepherd is mine. This brings us back to the question, what to do when Mr. Trial calls into you? You know, he might be walking up your footpath right now. Perhaps he's knocking on your door, or maybe he's even sitting at your table and he just won't leave. In knowing many of you as listeners, and in the lives of other people who I know well, I know this is very real for people today. People are experiencing difficulties and trials in many families, in many situations, in many homes, in many individuals' lives. In many ways, trials have called in and are calling in. What to do? I use the J.D. Phillips Bible sometimes for insight. The New Testament, in his rendition of James 1, verse 2, I will use that to close with today. In his typical way, Phillips punctuates verse 2, the end of it, with an exclamation point, which I believe encapsulates the truth of this joy that you can consider the trial that you're in right now. When all kinds of trials and temptations crowd into your lives, my brothers, don't resent them as intruders, but welcome them as friends. May God bless you.